Welcome back. Back in March, Vaer sent me one of their Hertiage Dark quartz models to review, and at the time I was really impressed with it. In fact, I still am. It's a thin, 40mm, great-looking field watch with 100 meters of water resistance and a screw-down crown. It's really a great go anywhere and do anything with type watch. And I think I ended that review by basically saying that I don't know if it's perfect, but I think it represents a damn good one-watch solution for most people. And the reason I said most people is because a lot of watch geeks and enthusiasts prefer automatics, and many of them would rather save up for an automatic than buy a quartz piece. And I remember a few comments that basically said they loved what Vaer was doing, but wish they had an automatic model. The thing is, Vaer's been listening to all this, and they've quietly been working in the background on a solution to bring an automatic model to light. And this week on July 9th is their Kickstarter to launch their new automatic line. And they were kind enough to lend me a prototype to do an early review on. Now, since this is a Kickstarter, I've only had a few days to spend with it before having to send it on to the next reviewer. But I can say in that short amount of time, I'm quite impressed with it. It seems like they took everything people loved about their quartz line and just put an automatic in it. But before we take a closer look, I want to remind some of you on what I think is one of the coolest things about Vaer, and that's that they're based out of Los Angeles, and I think specifically Venice Beach, and they used to assemble all of their watches in the area. And I say used to because that's also changing now with the automatic line, sort of. They're not just launching one watch, but a full automatic line. The first is like the one I received, which uses a miyota 9015 and still has the American assembled badge, as well as a similar version which uses an ETA movement instead and is actually Swiss made. And lastly, a Swiss made Dirty Dozen homage that also has an ETA. But today I'll be focusing on that miyota version, and I do want to stress that this is a prototype, so there will be some changes and more refinement in the final production version. And some of those changes I know about and I'll talk about as we go. Right off the bat, the one thing I'm going to say that impresses me the most is the case shape here, or more specifically its dimensions. It's 40mm wide without the crown, and just over 42 width, while lug to lug is 48mm. However, the impressive thing here is the thickness, at 10mm, and that's 10mm with a domed crystal and an exhibition case back. And just for reference, their quartz watches are 9.4mm. Going through Vaer's website, I found a blog post where they were talking about one of the initial prototypes for their automatic line. It was going to be a front-loaded case that was going to be 14mm thick. And I'm glad to see that they realized that that wasn't going to do and really wasn't what their customers wanted. So they kind of went back to the drawing board and hired a case designer. And this is the result. And I have to say I'm actually quite impressed with the case here. It mirrors the quartz version almost identically and is only about 0.5 millimeter taller, and that's with a domed crystal and the exhibition case back. As for price, I think full retail will be around $449 with a Kickstarter price of $329. But of course there are going to be early bird specials, which I think are going to be $299. And a miyota 15 right at $300 is a pretty good deal, so I'm willing to bet those early bird slots won't last long. And just like its quartz cousin, it has a 20mm lug width, so plenty of strap options out there. And more importantly, it has 100 meters of water resistance with a screw-down crown, which is really what made their previous watches so great. Unless you actually plan on diving, 100 meters with a screw-down crown is all anyone really needs. And the weight is also similar to their quartz models. I think this one's sitting at 80 grams with this Horween leather strap. So it hits that nice sweet spot where it's not too heavy, but still feels nice and solid in the hand. Before I even got the watch, Vaer mentioned that the finishing of the final production line will be a little bit better than what I was going to get, that it should be as good or even better than their quartz watches. So when I actually got my hands on this one, I was a little surprised, as I think the finishing here is pretty good and pretty comparable to their quartz watches. It has a very fine brushed finish throughout the watch. It's just very well done, and it seems to have this almost satin sheen to it. Overall, the case shape is a bit minimal, with your eyes mainly being focused on this clean bezel, as well as the very short curved lugs that extend down to the case back. And the holes for the spring bars are at the very tip of those lugs, which does help the watch wear better. Now looking at the side, the case has this very slightly rounded edge to it, which combined with that very fine brushing gives it an extremely smooth texture when you touch it. At the 3 o'clock we have the signed screw-down crown, and they did mention that the final version will have a slightly bigger crown, as I think this one is a 6x3 and the final version will have a 7x3. which is a good choice as I found this one a little too small and hard to manipulate. Although instead of making it taller, I think they need to make it wider, just like with the quartz versions, but that would increase the overall width. On the rear, you can see the screw-down exhibition case back, which is where all the important information is engraved on. And underneath it, you can see the Miyota 9015, which we'll talk more about in a minute. Back to the front, you have a very clean bezel that has this nice circular brushing that matches the case, and it contains a very slightly domed crystal, and that crystal is sapphire. Now this one I don't think has any AR coating on it, but they did say that final production would. But even without any, I never really noticed too much of a glare issue with this matte white dial underneath. Now I believe there are going to be 6 different dial options for this Miyota 9015 version. Now you'll have one that's very similar to their quartz field watch, as well as 2 that match their quartz Hertiage Dark. But the last 3 are a little bit of a newer design. They're maybe a bit modern, but still very easy to read. But the one that stood out the most for me was the one I requested. There's just something about this white dial combined with those light powder blue indices. And in some ways it might have a little bit of a Nomos thing going on. Now the execution of the dial is rather simple. I don't think there's anything applied, but it's this rather thick application of light blue Lume paint with a black outline. For the even hours you have Arabic numerals, and you have these very short dashes for the odd. There's also a very detailed chapter ring painted in black, with circled dots for hour indicators, and most of them also have that light powder blue Lume, except for the 2, 4, 8, and 10, which is just red without Lume. And I think this gives it a very distinct Lume profile. It kind of reminds me of a starburst pattern with those dashes, but we'll get to that in a minute. The text on the dial is also very minimal, and much like its quartz cousins, it just mostly stays out of the way. And that includes the American Assembled tag surrounding the 6. Although I can't help but think that for some reason, the Vaer logo looks like it's missing something. It's just a small black font surrounded by a sea of white. Although I wouldn't really change it, but it is something I noticed. Which leads us to the hands, which on this version are these silver syringe hands, compared to the sword of the Field and Heritage models. And that's one reason I really wanted to see this version, as I don't think you can ever go wrong with syringe hands. Now those hands are filled with white Lume, which does blend into the dial, but the silver outline is nice and wide and just really helps it stand out nicely. Not to mention the really long tip on the minute hand. And topping everything off is this red second hand that matches the red dots on the chapter ring. Although depending on the light, it does appear more orange than red at times. And one cool touch to that is a skeletonized tip. Now with these macro shots, always take them with a grain of salt, but especially here because this is a prototype, and there are a few issues with the paint on the dial. And I did mention that to Vaer, and they responded by saying that the final version will be much better. But in those macro shots, you can also see the hour and the minute hands, and I think the finishing on them is very good. Yet the star of these macro shots is obviously the second hand, and I just love this beautiful, thick, enamel-like finish to it. Now with regard to length, I think it's perfect here, as the second hand and minute just go all the way out to the chapter ring. And that's where you can see that skeletonized portion of the second hand just sweeping over the numerals. Going back to my previous review, there were some criticisms of the Hertiage Dark that they thought the dial was way too simple in terms of its price. And you can say that here as well. But I think you need to remember that it really just fits the style they're going for. And all you have to do is look at some similarly priced Tussauds and Hamiltons to see a similar style. Now that said, I really do like the look of this light version. As I said, there's just something I really like about that matte white dial with just a pop of light blue color. And in some ways that shouldn't surprise me because it's a similar thing that the Helm Komodo has. But above all, I really love the red second hand as it sweeps the dial. It just stands out and really helps define the style. As for the Lume, well, Vaer mentioned that the final version should be better than this prototype. But as it is, I think the prototype is pretty good, at least as far as field or casual watches go. Now it's not as good as I'd like, but not everyone is obsessed with Lume like I am. As it is right now, I really love the look of the Lume profile, whereas I said it just reminds me of a starburst effect, which I think looks brilliant in that neon blue color. And when you compare it to the Hertiage Dark, I really appreciate that you can see the full outline of the syringe hands rather than just a rectangle on the sword. Now for a full comparison, I put this up against that Hertiage Dark, as well as my Hamilton Khaki King and a Glycian Airman. So at first glance, I don't think the Lume on the hands of the automatic are quite as bright as the others, but they are pretty close. yet I think the dial is brilliantly lit. But after 40 minutes, I think the automatic was clearly holding its own. And one thing to remember is that the glowing Smurf blue of a BGW9 Lume isn't quite as bright as a C3, but I do think it's more distinct and easier on the eyes. So even if they don't improve it, I think the Lume is pretty good. I think Vaer picked the perfect movement for this watch, which is a Miyota 9015. It's a high beat movement with 28,800 beats per hour, so you get that smooth second hand that people want, as well as the regular hacking, hand winding, and basically everything else you want. But more importantly, it's priced much more competitively than its Swiss counterparts. And more importantly is that it's an extremely thin movement, which is one of the ways they're able to keep this watch so thin at 10mm. If they had chosen to go with something like a Seiko NH35 or the Miyota 8215, then it probably would have been 14mm tall. And lastly, let's talk about the straps. Now, all but 2 of the ones I've shown were sent with the watch. And I'm not really sure what the final options are going to be for the Kickstarter, but I think they will include the ones I've shown. I'm not going to go over them in too much detail, because as I said, I'm not sure which ones are going to be included, but I'll say that easily my favorites are the two pieces with quick release. And that's this Horween leather one, as well as this thick nylon 2-piece. They just seem like good quality straps that I really like the look of. Regardless of which strap you put it on, I think the Vaer automatic wears brilliantly. On my 7-inch wrist, I just think it hits that sweet spot, where you still get a nice presence, but it's extremely comfortable to wear. And that 10mm height is just perfect and helps the watch stay out of the way. And in some ways I feel almost like I'm wearing a mechanical because it's so thin. At the end of my Hertiage Dark review, I said that I thought it was a perfect watch for Southern California. And that's not just because that's where Vaer is from, as well as it's where I'm from. And I think it's a design that perfectly lends itself to be just at home in a formal work setting, as much as drinking beer on the beach. As well as Southern California is a very unique place geographically. It's one of the few locations in the world that within a single day, you could find yourself skiing, going for a hike in the desert, and spending the rest of the afternoon at the beach. Not to mention, you could then top it all off with a very nice dinner at the end of the day. Just remember to take a shower before the last part. So the Hertiage Dark, with its 100 meters of water resistance, sapphire, and a screw-down crown, is a near perfect watch for that kind of environment. So I'm happy to see that Vaer took their time to make sure their automatic fit that mold just as perfectly. I think it really is going to be a great one-watch solution, something that you can wear to help you tackle whatever life throws at you, and do it with a bit of style. I think Vaer did a great job here. They took what people loved about their quartz pieces and implemented it with only 0.5 millimeter of added thickness. So I don't think they're going to have any problem reaching their Kickstarter goals, especially because I think there are a large number of Hamilton fans who weren't quite as enthusiastic with the recent movement changes, where they dropped the beat rate, even if they did give you an extra power reserve. And if you're one of those, then take a look here, because I think it could offer a great alternative. So for those who are interested, I'll put a link down below to their Kickstarter. Otherwise, let me know in a comment what you think about the Vaer automatic, and if you are interested in one, which dial version are you going to go for? Because I think I'm pretty partial to this one. And as always, if you enjoyed the video, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Thanks for joining me.